Welcome to NAGPRA Inventories. I will be your instructor, Eric Hemenway, and we are going to talk about one of the most important elements of the NAGPRA process, and that is the inventories. The inventories are part of a federal law called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990. This law focuses on the return of Native American human remains, cultural items, and protection of Native American burial sites. Training will cover what an inventory is and who must compile one, the legal definition of categories under an inventory, and why an inventory is necessary under NAGPRA. So full disclaimer at this point, this training is to go with how the current regulations are as they stand. The regulations that apply to Native American human remains possibly could change within the next year or two. So I would encourage you to keep up to date on the most up-to-date regulations that apply to the law by going to the National NAGPRA website. Learning objectives. What is an inventory and who must compile one? Absolutely necessary and very important. What is the legal definition of categories under an inventory? And why is an inventory necessary under the law? I'm a former practitioner of NAGPRA. I worked for a tribe carrying out their NAGPRA duties for about 8 years. And one of the first things I had to learn was, what are these lists? And these lists are in two categories of inventories and summaries. And when I was doing this as a full-time job, the priority for the tribe was human remains, getting human remains back and then getting them back for reburial. And so for many tribes that I've talked with over the course of my work under NAGPRA, this was also their priority of getting their ancestors back. So in order to do this, they needed to know who had the ancestors. And that's really step one for a lot of the repatriation process. And this is why it's so important that these inventories be completed and be completed successfully and in a complete manner. So what is an inventory in detail? It's all federal agencies and institutions that fall under NAGPRA. These are, any type of municipality, museum, organization, state governments that have received federal funding. They fall under the category of a museum under NAGPRA. They have to compile an inventory if it applies. And an inventory is it's a legal requirement under the law. So it's something that has to be done. It's not a may, it's a must. It's very important to note that. And inventories only apply to Native American human remains and the associated funerary objects with those remains. Now you could have what we call unassociated funerary objects, but that gets into a different list called the summary, which is for a different training. We're only focusing on the Native American human remains and any items that are associated with those remains. Here is a definition under the law. Feel free to go and look at this in more detail at your leisure with the regs. Again, the regs could change in the next year or two, but this training applies to how the regs stand currently. A definition under the law. Each museum or federal agency that has possession or control of the collected remains and associated funerary objects is to compile an inventory of such objects based on the information that they have. And this is something where a lot of museums and federal agencies, when NAGPRA was first passed, they compiled their inventories immediately in the early 90s. But from my experience of doing the work, some of these inventories weren't done to the best capabilities. So a lot of museums and agencies had to go back and to amend their inventories. They found new collections. They found, new human remains, or they miscounted. So I would strongly encourage, if you are going through the process or have gone through the process, to go back and double check your numbers, and also to consult with tribes when putting these inventories together. And through the consultation process, it's also possible to establish cultural affiliation to a set of human remains. This has happened numerous times when I was doing the work. A museum had sets of remains. They knew they were from my state of Michigan. And through the consultation process, them putting together the inventory, they had to get an exact number of individuals called the MNI, minimum number of individuals. They had to establish, if they could, where they were from, provenience. They had that. They said, this is, Michigan. We're looking at what tribes, what, Native nations are from the area. And they started to reach out and consult with those Native nations. And through this process of consultation, we're actually able to culturally affiliate the remains to a specific tribe. So they go from this category of what they currently state as culturally unidentifiable to culturally affiliated. So this can certainly happen through the consultation process of compiling the inventory. Now, if the inventory is already complete at an institution or federal agency, that's not to say you can't go back and consult on that existing inventory. This inventory may have been put together from staff 10, 15, 20 years ago who never consulted with the tribe. And now as the person or individual or team that has inherited this responsibility on behalf of an institution or agency, you can go back and reinvigorate that consultation process or start it anew. So it's very important to know that consultation can occur at any time through the inventory process. Museums and federal agencies are encouraged to undertake inventories of those portions of the collection which information is readily available. And again, I've worked on numerous repatriations where information wasn't readily available. There was very scant information. Maybe they only had provenience or some handwritten notes. And so again, through the consultation process, you can help to build that information base of who these people are. And I really choose my words carefully when talking about inventories. I try not to use the term collections or artifacts. These are, in my belief, individuals. These are people, ancestors. So that's something to know too when you're talking about inventories and what they represent. Wording is really important. Most of the Native nations I've worked with, ancestors or the early ones, terms that have this connection with these individuals in the present day is really something I really strongly encourage when you're in this consultation process of working. And this is by far, from my own personal experience, one of the more sensitive aspects of working under NAGPRA is people. And this is what we're working with is individuals. Some of the individuals I've personally repatriated, have been a part of the repatriation process and reburied were 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And I wouldn't have been able to get to this point of reburying this ancient person without having an inventory. I needed to know exactly where, what institution had what. And the inventory provides that. The inventory says, we have X amount of Native individuals in our collections. And this is where we believe these Native individuals are from. And those are the foundations for these repatriation of ancestors. So in this image, it's just a great mound. Moundsville, West Virginia. I got this from the Library of Congress. And just to show that, early settlers were taking note of Indian burials, Native burials, and that burials come in a lot of different shapes and forms for different tribal nations across the continent. It's not always a mound, but many times it is. And so when I would look at an inventory, I would look for key pieces of information that would help identify this as a Native burial. And one of these is a mound. Settlers weren't burying their dead in mounds. Native nations were, and this has been a practice for thousands of years. Some mounds were large, like in this image, it shows a very large mound, and it looks like to be almost like a small, much larger than the house that is in this image. But some mounds I've seen are very small, maybe only 2 or 3 feet above the ground, and most of the burials are beneath the ground. So mounds are a very strong indicator of a Native burial. But this is part of the information that I would use to make the argument that they are Native, that the remains in the inventory are Native. The method of burial, whether it's a mound or a cave or locations that specific Native nation used historically and culturally to put their dead to rest. There's different burial methods, from tribe to tribe, and you have to go through the consultation process to help, establish what methods and means best help describe or identify the set of remains that you have in your collection. And if that information isn't present, it just isn't present. I'm aware of this. I've worked with a lot of museums where they just didn't have the info that they would get in, they would get the remains from donations or from road construction or building and development. And this is in the early 20th century, late 19th century. They would just literally donate the remains and give the remains to the local museum, the museum that was closest to the site. And these museums would just inherit these individuals, and they would sit for decades, sometimes a century, with no information at all. But in other cases, there's very detailed information about the remains, and all of this needs to go into an inventory, whether it's a deliberate archaeological dig where they have all the notes and they have photos and publications, reports, possibly dissertations. That all needs to be part of the information that is associated with an inventory. But if you don't have the information, you have to note that as well. So again, this is a legal requirement. It has to be done if you are a museum that falls under NAGPRA. And all federal agencies have to compile one regardless. If you don't have any Native American human remains in your collections, in your institution, then you don't have to compile an inventory. It doesn't apply to you. But if you do have human remains, you have to determine, for one, are they Native American? That's the first establishment. And under the law, we have what we call preponderance of evidence. And I had no idea what this meant when I first started. I'm not a lawyer, but this became a very important term in doing the work. And preponderance of evidence is basically saying that 51% is in favor and 49% is not in favor. So it's a very liberal way of saying what is Native American human remains and what isn't. And a lot of this is based on the collection histories of these institutions, that they don't have the information. And we have to have something in place to help determine or push these remains into this, are they Native or not? So that's the standard. And so when you're going through the process, if you have Native American, or if you have human remains, for one, first you have to determine, are they Native American? Sometimes you just have to determine if they're human, because a lot of times I've seen, animal remains being commingled with Native American human remains. And this could be by design. This could be an associated funerary object. Some burial practices for some tribes, they inter sacred animals with their ancestors, and that's what they do. But sometimes it's just remains getting mixed up at an institution due to negligence or somebody not paying attention. So that's one of the first things we have to establish is, if there are remains, are they human? Are there any type of animal, commingled with them? Are the, commingled animal remains part of a burial practice, a burial ritual? All this can be fleshed out through consultation. And then numbers, how many individuals do we have, in our collections? Is it one? Is it 100? And this could be represented by a single finger or a single tooth or a complete individual. So that all has to be taken into account when putting these inventories together. So I can't stress enough how important it is to have a solid inventory. So when I first started doing NAGPRA and I started to realize what the inventories were, I would go to the National NAGPRA website, and once you compile your inventory, you have to send it into National NAGPRA, and they put it on their website. So individuals who are practicing can look and say, okay, who has what for my state? And so I go in and I look at all of, I choose by Michigan, and I just go through and start scrolling through. And this has a list of all the museums and federal agencies that have Native American human remains from my state. And from that point, I just start to contact all these institutions who have Native American human remains from my area. So start from the home base and work out. So this is so critical that this is compiled and done in a timely manner. So also part of the legal requirements is the consultation. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times I was running into these situations where consultation wasn't occurring at the beginning of the compiling of the inventories. And they would, in the early 90s, this is again, just from my personal experience, very limited consultation would occur. They would label the remains as culturally unidentifiable, and then they would sit there. But we went back, we consulted with the museum 10, 15 years later, and in some cases, we were able to culturally affiliate the remains and have them returned to a specific tribe. So if you are just finding that you have Native American human remains, please consult with your local tribes. An inventory has to be completed 5 years after the enactment of the law. And something that can really help with putting the inventory together is, a documentation grant through the National NAGPRA program. If you're short-staffed, you have a great deal of work ahead of you. You can use these grants to, help bring in some consultants and some experts to speed up the process. But there is a timeline for this. And updated or amended inventories are to be submitted to National NAGPRA. This happens all the time where, a museum is going through, they say, okay, we have our inventory completed. It's been submitted in 94, 95. We're good. But then they go into a room and they find a box of human remains. I've seen this happen over and over. And then they have to go back and they have to amend their inventory. So if you're in that situation, you're not alone. It's happened many, many times. And you just simply submit a corrected, amended inventory to National NAGPRA. Don't sit on the remains, and they have to go into your new list. So what are the basics for an inventory? One of the most important aspects of NAGPRA. An inventory is a detailed list of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects. And associated funerary objects vary from tribe to tribe drastically. Tribes out west use different things from the Midwest and from out east and Alaska and Hawaii and so on and so forth. So you have to really pay attention to what is with the remains in terms of the burial objects. One repatriation that I was a part of years ago, the remains somehow made their way out to Nebraska. They were from Michigan. They were sold to this museum during the early 20th century, which is unfortunately very common. And I say me, myself, and I drove out to Nebraska because we didn't feel very comfortable flying with a set of remains. Just was our decision at the time. It was a larger number. It was 6 individuals. So drove out to Nebraska, met with the museum staff, got the individuals, and I was expecting, these full sets of people, and it just wasn't. It was just 6 skulls. And I asked where the rest of the people were, and they said, well, this is all we got. And this is what happened, unfortunately, a lot during this time period, was the trafficking of human remains. And there was a large market for Native American skulls. And so people would go through and just take the heads of ancestors and sell them. And so we had the ledger book. It was all written out of, what they paid for the individual. I think it was $4 to $6. And that there was a name and a provenience. So the documentation was pretty solid in terms of where they were from, county, even a township. So we knew exactly where they were from. And they even said, from Indian Mound, so-and-so county, township. And that was just how they came to them. And so we got them back. But then the staff at the museum said, well, we have these really unique associated funerary objects, and do you want them to go with them? I'm like, absolutely. And so there were these shells, and they had all these different carvings of different spirits and designs. I've never seen anything like it. And she said, they came with them, they need to go back, and there was hundreds of them. So upon receiving these shells, before we interred them with the remains, we had one of our artists take sketches of them. We didn't feel comfortable taking photos of the objects, but we did sketches. And so this became part of our our database. So if we ever see something like this at other museums, we can use that as a reference, saying these are probably, associated or unassociated or associated funerary objects based on this scenario, this case that we worked on. So that's just something to think about in terms of if you have these collections. So an inventory is not a summary. A summary applies to sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony, and unassociated funerary objects. It's a completely different list, and that's for a different training in the near future. And again, NAGPRA does not apply to any Smithsonian institution and their collections. They have their own separate law. And when remains and associated funerary objects are repatriated, they have their own type of Federal Register notice. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And only Native American tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, and lineal descendants can have Native American human remains and associated funerary objects repatriated to them. So it's a very, very across the board in terms of who can repatriate. This applies, with remains, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony. It's, the tribes and lineal descendants and NHOs. So this is who NAGPRA applies to. So also with our inventory basics, new scientific research is not required under law in compiling of an inventory. Museums and agencies, when requested by a tribe or NHO or lineal descendant, have to provide all the information pertaining to inventory. This is very, very important. So as I got more seasoned in doing repatriation work, this would be one of the first things I would ask in terms of human remains is please send me everything that you have pertaining to these collections. Any type of reports, notes, possible dissertations, chapters in books, maps, anything, even photos. We personally, when I did this, didn't take photos of remains, but we would receive and accept photos if they are in existence. We didn't need new photos taken. We didn't want new photos taken. But if it was from a site and they're taking photos, then we would use that to the best of our abilities. And so, for example, if they're taking just photos of the site in general, not just the remains, we're looking at the landscape, what types of environment, is it on the shore? Is it in a cave? Is it a mound? And so on and so forth. So existing photos we would accept, knowing that they would be, sensitive materials. Any type of ledgers, again, these receipts, even though it was difficult for myself to read these, but it provided information to help get them back. So I always kept that in mind that, this is very unethical, very disturbing to read about what happened to these people being unearthed and sold and trafficked, but I'm using this information to help get them back. So that was something I, did within my own self to help get through the work. But they can be very important piece of information. Just be prepared. You're going to see things that are disturbing, and that's part of the work. It was by far the most rewarding, but yet the most challenging part of doing repatriation for myself was going through and getting the individuals, but seeing the history of how they went from resting to a state of unrest and then putting them back and hopefully to a state of rest. So it's emotionally challenging at times, mentally challenging. There's a lot of frustration at times doing this work, but that's part of the process. And I would see this also with museum staff who are non-native. They would struggle at times. I inherited this. I see, how we come to acquire these remains, and we just want to do the right thing to make sure that they have their proper respects paid. So it can be a challenging task to do this, but again, very rewarding when it happens. Some of the museums that I've worked with in the past, we use this experience of repatriation of human remains to build a relationship that is still here, intact to this day at different museums, working on exhibits and programs and professional development. So it can be a great building block for future relationships. And some of the museums I never talked to again, and that's okay. But we did it, we made it happen, and we went on our separate ways, but that's all right. Also, loans. This is very important. If any remains or associated funerals are on loan, that information has to be provided to the tribe who's requesting information on the inventories. I've seen this happen a few times that, they put this inventory out 10, 15, 20 years ago, but they neglected to say that this object, or if there was associated funerary object or set of funerary remains is on loan, that has to be accounted for. You have to let the tribe know that we have control of it, but we don't have possession. The physical possession is somewhere else. And if a loan agreement exists, that has to be provided for as well. So what are the details in an inventory? There's certain details that have to be listed. And one of the main ones is the MNI, the minimum number of individuals. This is the total of all the Native American human remains in the control of a museum or an agency. Again, this could be a single tooth, a single finger, a vertebrae, a toe, one skull, or it could be the totality of an individual. So you have to know exactly how many people you have in your collections. If it is uncertain, the MNI, it's very advisable to bring in an expert to determine a final number. This could be a forensic anthropologist, an osteologist, and I've seen these individuals work numerous times where we come into a repatriation and the museum says, I think we have, 10, 12 people. I said, well, we need a definitive. We can't, ballpark this. And so they would go through and they would, find somebody like a forensic anthropologist, and they would come in and they would say, oh no, you have 20 individuals. So they would have to amend their inventory from their original number. And then some of this, they would say, okay, this is, an otter bone or, part of a bear. And so we had to go through and consult and figure out what's the probability of this being an associated funerary object based on the tribe and their burial customs. And then in some cases, we were determining that some of the remains were not native at all. And I don't know how they do this at all. This isn't my field. This isn't my expertise, but it was theirs. And that's why we brought them. And they said, no, this person is not native. It's African-American or it's a Caucasian, but they just been commingled together for whatever reasons at this institution. And we'd have to tease these out because NAGPRA doesn't apply to anybody that's not native. So then the number would change again. So they thought they had X amount and they said, no, it's actually lesser because these people aren't native. So this is all sort of the things you have to look for when putting the inventory together. So it's advisable if you don't have an exact number to have these types of contacts and experts on hand. Again, certain fauna can be commingled remains as part of burial rites, and they are considered associated funerary objects. And you have to separate these out to get an accurate MNI number. And also, funerary objects can be as simple as sand that was brought with the remains, certain rocks, pieces of wood that were part of a burial object that started to disintegrate over time. It could be beads, it could be shells, it could be pieces of copper, it could be pieces of flint. I mean, there's all types of different natural materials that tribes use as part of an associated funerary object. So again, if you have these collections, just please don't start discarding anything that's associated with them. It could be there for a very specific purpose. And again, through the consultation process, you'll have a better idea if these objects are not. So the provenience is also very important when putting together an inventory. This is one of the pieces of information I would key in on immediately is how many individuals, but we got to know, absolutely have to know is where are they from? Because as a individual Native person from Michigan, it's not my job to look at remains from Texas or remains from Florida. I'm focusing on my tribe's home base in this state. And so I have to know what's from the home base, what's from my homelands. And so provenience is absolutely critical in putting an inventory together if you have that information. And just even the state alone, if we know the state, that's a huge piece of information. But if we can start drilling down into counties and towns and villages and townships, that really, really helps in determining which tribes are the most appropriate to consult with. and then the eventual repatriation of the remains. Because remember, under the current regulations, all Native American human remains are to be returned through certain processes under the law. So the more you can figure out where they're from, the higher likelihood you can figure out of what tribes to contact first. So if you can figure the state out, great. But if you can get down to that, more detailed information of provenience, cities, townships, then that really, really helps. So unfortunately, sometimes provenience can't be available. And I've, again, seen this on a lot of inventories that they get listed as unknown or the Z unknown. And if you don't know, then you just don't know. So you got to, unfortunately, list these as, that unknown category. And if applicable, update the existing inventory, maybe, the changes to your M&I, you find human remains, you figure out some remains are native, they're not native. Some were animal. So, constantly evaluate your collections to get to the most accurate spot. And the repatriation of the remains is the goal with these inventories, that they're being compiled with the goal of them being returned to the most appropriate tribal nation or individual. So that's always the goal with putting these lists together. And the details is as much as you can compile without being too intrusive of the remains themselves. A lot of tribes don't want, more intrusive study of the remains. It depends on the tribe, how much information they want. But the number is absolutely necessary, the number of funerary objects. But then some studies that have already been conducted, will show the age of the remains. That's something, we've seen a bit. It did, will say it did help us, and, with our consultation with these museums, when they said, okay, these remains are 1,000 years old or 2,000 years old. And it comes into, I think, a deeper consultation where, okay, this predates European contact on this continent. And this is something that, a lot of history doesn't like to address, is the native side of history pre-contact. And, we have, as native nations, come to this wall where if it wasn't written down, then it didn't apply to the current day tribes. And so we had to go to this deeper level of consultation saying, we were here for thousands of years. And this is one of the main, reasons for NAGPRA is to get these ancestors back, because we have these beliefs, traditions, cultures, spiritual beliefs, religion, whatever you want to, label this, that were connected. So these age of these remains was really important. But it took, I think, an extra level of consultation to establish the reasoning of why we're pursuing these individuals, because it's something that most historians and a lot of, I think most of the general public doesn't look at is, something that's 2,000 years old, is that related to a present day tribe? But for tribal people, it's like, absolutely, that's related to us. So that age is important, but again, it takes a little bit more consultation when you get into these older remains. And the oldest remains I've ever reburied were around 3,000 years old. And when we got to that point, the museum I was working with said, Eric, these are really old individuals, and we're going to return them, but how do you know they're related to your people? And so, without crossing any cultural or boundaries or protocols, some of the stories, the beliefs that have been handed down from generation to generation, that became part of the consultation process, without delving into appropriation or giving too much. We gave enough where we felt comfortable to get the remains back, but also explain that this is us. So that goes hand in hand with provenience. These remains were from a very specific area. We knew exactly what county they were from, and then we looked at, okay, this is the county, what tribes are close to the county, and what our tribe was one of those tribes, and there was another tribe. So we started to talk amongst ourselves and with the museum. And since we had that information of history, okay, this is the tribe, this is the area, and we just built around that. So it was an ideal situation where we had all this information, but also the tribes were there. And that may not be the situation for other areas, other proveniences. That tribe may have been removed. So if you're in a place like Kentucky or Ohio or Indiana, and you have these remains, and the county and even the town or township, you got to look to those removed tribes again and say what tribe historically, was here, but then they got removed. And then tribes also moved, in their historical patterns of utilizing land and cultural resources. So again, it's not just who's there right now. You got to look at the historical timeline of who was in that area. So in this photo, it's just kind of it's from the National Park Service, and it's just a photo of collections at a museum. And in one side, we have just the atypical archival boxes, museum boxes, and very nondescript. They're all the same color. They have some notes on the box. And then on the other side of the photo is your metal shelving that's at these larger archives and museums with all this row of pottery. And I chose this photo because this is what a lot of times we see when we go into these museums. And so many times I go into these museum collections and see these boxes, and just rows and rows and rows of boxes. But within these boxes are people. And on these labels on this box, it will say such and such tribe or such and such state, minimum number of individuals. So they have all this information, on this box, but within that box is, individuals. So just to be mindful, if you're going into these spaces, that this, you could be walking by ancestors, and then also as a museum and compiling your inventories, the most proper storage for ancestors, and consult with that tribe that has the strongest connection with those ancestors. Is there certain colors of fabric that they need to be wrapped in? Do they need to be separated from individuals? Other collections. This is something that is really an important part of the repatriation process, is the holding of the ancestors until they're returned. And then on this other side of the photo is this long row of just these pots. And I just think, in my mind, this doesn't apply to, my tribe. This looks more, Southwest. But what is the story behind these pots? Do they come from a burial? Is it possible that they are an unassociated funerary object? So these are things you just got to, do that deeper dive into consultation or your own records. You could be having in your own collections, things that need to be accounted for. So collection history is really important. It's also challenging to look at, honestly, how do we acquire these human remains? But it also can lead to, filling in some of the pieces of the puzzle. So if available, include the collection history of the remains and associated funerary objects in the inventory. So who collected the remains is really important. So well-known collectors in the history of collecting can help actually affiliate remains because they operate in certain areas predominantly. And collectors often specialize in certain regions or traded with other collectors. So this paper trail of trading, selling, and advertisement can lead to affiliation. We've used this on multiple occasions where one very well-known collector in the Great Lakes, he really was specific on one or two, three tribes. And he was prolific. He spent decades. He was independently wealthy. He had the funds, the means to do what he wanted to do. A lot of times it was unethical. He'd go dig, he'd go loot graves, but he always had his name attached to these things. And one of the museums we were working with had some human remains, but they didn't have the provenience, but they had the collector. They said, well, 70 years ago, we bought this set of remains from so-and-so. So right then and there, from the other information we knew about this individual, I was like, this is the area and the tribes he was really, really fixated on. So through this collection history, we're able to, again, preponderance of evidence, show that it has a very high likelihood these remains were from this state and probably applied to these tribes based on that collector's history. So collecting history is really important. And then also these purchase records, these ledgers. What was the method of acquisition? Was it a donation? Was it a purchase? Was it a gift? Construction, road work, archaeology, loans. This is all really important and also necessary to have and provide to tribes who are requesting this information. One of the larger repatriations I worked on, maybe one of the largest, was about 60 individuals, and it was all from road construction. And they were put in a road in Michigan in the 1920s. They came upon what they called an archaeological site. They didn't bring in any experts. That just wasn't happening at the time. And everything that they dug up, they just literally gave to the closest museum, and it was all people. And we got the people back, we reburied them, but that was the story of how they got that. And they had it all in their records. And, from the Department of Transportation, the surveyors who were working on it, they did take some notes. And that was all part of the collection history. More with collection history. It is known that collecting practices and catalog methods have not been the best by museums and some federal agencies. Sometimes records can be very scarce, they can be spotty. So just use what you have that's available. But working with the tribe may bring new information to light on existing collections. Again, the power of consultation. You can't magically produce records that just aren't there. And a lot of times you're inheriting these collections and the information that goes with them. So, but through consultation, you can hopefully piece together some more of what the history is that pertains to these collections. So something that has been in the news quite a bit of late, but has been with Native people for well over a century, is Indian boarding schools. And this is a photo of a group shot of pupils at the Carlisle Indian boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, one of the largest and I would say infamous boarding schools in the country. And I put this information and image in this training because there was over 400 of these boarding schools across the country. And this is its own talk program, training, etc. But NAGPRA does apply because so many of these schools are basically adjacent to burial grounds where children would pass away at the school and they would be buried next to the school. So there's been some pretty high profile repatriations with Carlisle. They know exactly what kids pass at the schools, where they're from, the tribe, etc. And some of those tribal nations have been going and getting their kids back and bringing them back home to their homelands. So, but Carlisle is one of 400, and the Department of Interior has launched an investigation into boarding schools. This is ongoing. We currently are, within Indian country and also within the government of the United States, figuring out exactly where the schools are, who went to the schools, but this is a piece of the story. It can't be ignored that if there's 400 of these institutions, and at many of these institutions, native children passed. So if you do have this history in your area, that yes, there was a boarding school there at one time, the building may not be standing, but we know that school did exist. It could have been for a few years or 80 years. You have to treat that with an extra level of sensitivity, but also of awareness that there possibly could be burials around that site. So associated funerary objects are with the remains. They're part of the death rite or ceremony of a culture. These are the objects with the remains. They're associated with the current set of remains. Unassociated deals with summaries, which is again is another training that we'll get into shortly. But these are the objects with the remains, and these objects I mentioned before vary from tribe to tribe, from culture to culture. So you have to really pay attention to what you have in front of you. Now, some things could be more universal. They're used by multiple tribes. Again, through consultation, this will flesh itself out. But you have to treat all of these objects that are with the remains as unique. is that this is with this set of remains. So please, if you have your collections, keep them intact. Don't separate the, put the objects over here, keep them with the remains as much as possible. I've seen, this happen with a lot of collections where they just start to, or, they started to take all of these objects out, and then they would find their way into, they would have these small stones that were part of the burial ritual, but say, oh, we're going to put this in, the geology collections or so on and so forth. And it's been really hard to, put these collections back together. So if you have these objects that are with the remains, keep them with the remains. So what could be, what are some of the associated funerary objects that are pretty common that I've saw? A lot of animal remains, shells, different pieces of fibers, lithics. These could be little effigies. It could be pipes, fire starting kits. I've seen a lot. Pottery, some minerals. Red ochre is big in the Great Lakes. Rocks, beads, feathers, points. Post-contact materials may be included in some burials. So these, metal knives. I've seen a lot of kettles, a lot of jewelry in burials from the Great Lakes. And it is not uncommon for post-contact native burials to have a mix of traditional and European American goods in their burials. So I've seen some associated funerary objects where they have red ochre, they have flint, but then they have, a silver gorget or a silver bracelet, mixed together. So that was really common for us in the Great Lakes. And again, I see a lot of these kettles. I saw a lot of these kettles. Once I seen it, the first repatriation where I got an unassociated funerary object of a kettle back, I looked at all these different, museum records and looked for these kettles, and they're all really small, real small copper kettles that became a real hallmark for these burial objects from my area. But that'll not always apply to different tribes in different areas. So we've talked a lot about consultation. Very, very important part of the process when, compiling inventories, and also when tribes are, going through the repatriation process of having that constant dialogue that is always ongoing. I would, encourage this constant open line of communication, particularly for inventories, because you're dealing with the most sensitive part of NAGPRA, in my mind, is the ancestors. So having that open dialogue was one of the most important tools in the 30 plus repatriations I worked on, which were primarily for human remains, which were coming from inventories. So having that consultation always present, this dialogue, can't stress it enough. And we would figure out, again, the provenience. Are there any associated funerary objects? How should I store these? Who's going to come pick them up? Are there any protocols for handling? If there are going to be any type of medicines you want to be, put around the remains, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all part of the process and should be carried out from day one to the very end. So more on consultation. We mentioned before, we can affiliate. We can take it from a state of non-affiliation, cultural identifiable, to affiliation through consultation. And then also whose lands they are from. And this is such a critical part. We've gone through this multiple times in this with the provenience. If we know exactly what tribal lands they're from, within the boundaries of a present day reservation or on tribal lands, and we know exactly what tribe to repatriate to, but we get into this broader context of Aboriginal lands, then we're looking at sometimes groups of tribes, and this occurs, that tribes share territories. And sometimes you have to have a joint repatriation where multiple tribes will be part of this one claim, this one repatriation for individuals. And some of these joint repatriations could be 3 tribes, it could be 20 tribes. And some of these joint repatriation claims could be for 5 people. I've seen them as up to 100 individuals. So it's not always just the one tribe. Sometimes you see these joint repatriation claims, and this goes to a whole nother level of consultation because you're dealing with multiple tribes, multiple tribal NAGPRA designees and tribal leaders. But that's what needs to happen when you have, these larger repatriation claims for individuals. And so I've seen some of the Federal Register notices have, sometimes 30 tribes, 40 tribes. Now, do they talk with every single tribe on that list? Maybe, maybe not. But usually, a group of tribes will act as the lead tribes for these joint repatriations. But regardless, the consultation is occurring and the ancestors are going back. Consultation should be done as soon as possible, no later than the completion of an inventory. Consultation during the inventory process can again lead to affiliation. And the priority of consultation is lineal descendants of the remains from tribal lands, remains from Aboriginal lands. And the vast majority of remains will come from areas designated as Aboriginal lands. The more tips on consultation. Consultation often begins with a letter to the tribes or the NHOs from the agency or the museum. That is the beginning of consultation, not the completion, especially with inventories, face-to-face conversations, telephone calls, or now we have, Zooms or Teams or Skypes can really help with, facilitate consultation, especially if we're looking at, areas that, the tribe is in one part of the country and the museum is in another. These virtual meetings can really help with this consultation process. And also the grants. These consultation grants are available through National NAGPRA. Really strongly encourage, utilizing these grants. That's what they're there for. So if you have this opportunity to bring in a tribal consultant to your museum, that's what the grant's for. And yes, it's handy to have a Zoom or, a virtual conference, but to have tribal leaders and experts in the space to interact with the ancestors and to give that firsthand consultation, there's nothing like it. It just really helps the whole process. But if you can't do it due to resources and distance, there are other means to carry out the consultation. So more consultation tips. The initial inventory consultation letter should go to the tribe's official NAGPRA designee. The letter should include a brief description of the remains and, if applicable, the unassociated funerary objects. Also in the letter is a section of NAGPRA that the inventory consultation provisions fall under. So, associated funerary object, human remains, these are the categories we're looking at with an inventory. And also the basic information in the letter should be included what state or region the remains come from. Sometimes we don't have a specific state. It says Great Plains or Great Lakes or West Coast. That's what they have. And so a lot of times museums who don't have that information will send these letters out to really hundreds of tribes just to cover their bases. So we'd receive these letters and, Great Plains doesn't apply to us, so we don't reply. So that's a whole different set of tribes and tribal nations. But if it said Great Lakes, then okay, this is our homelands, and we pay more attention to it and respond when necessary. And then also your contact information has to be on these letters, so we know who we're talking to, who to contact with emails and phone numbers and so on and so forth. So consultation resources, determining what tribes to consult with on an inventory can be based on the tribes' names that are listed with the remains on the museum records. And again, sometimes tribal names can have different spellings. So that's something to really pay attention to. Also, if no tribes are identified, the geographic region with the remains originate. So look at, again, provenience, where the remains from, and then look at which tribes have historic ties and also current day ties to that area. And so here's some resources to kind of help figure out, where tribes historically have been, with some treaty maps and some Indian Claims Commission maps. And something that I use and also recommend quite a bit is the Handbook of North American Indians. And it's not perfect. It's not, the end all be all in terms of Native history, but it's a very good starting point for individuals who who have little to no knowledge of the area that they're in terms of Native history. And in this photo, it's from the National Park Service, actually from the National NAGPRA website, of a repatriation occurring. And it's just a long procession of individuals, Native individuals, who are returning a large number of ancestors back. So each repatriation really is unique to each tribe. Now in this photo, it shows just at least 20 people, and the photo cuts off even more people carrying one box. Some tribes will have a large group setting like this, large group engagement. Some tribes won't. They'll send 1 or 2 people to get all the remains, and they will have those individuals carry out all of the reburial duties and practices and so on and so forth. So this is at the discretion of the tribe. Once the remains have been transferred legally to the tribe is in control of how that repatriation will occur. So this is just an example of a very large group. It looks like a public setting. They're walking, down a path. I can see houses in the background. Maybe it's on a reservation, maybe it's not. I can't tell, but the large number of tribal participation shows that the community is very involved in this. But that's not always the case. Sometimes tribes will just send, like I said, 1 or 2 people to carry out the work. So there are certain federal registers just for inventories for human remains and associated funerary objects. They're called NICs, Notice of Inventory Completion. And there are templates for these NICs on the National NAGPRA website. Again, a repatriation cannot occur. The transfer of human remains under inventories cannot legally occur until a federal register notice has been published, and it's been published for 30 days. There's been no counterclaims, there's been no contest, and on the 31st day, the museum or federal agency can legally transfer those remains to the appropriate tribe or lineal descendant. Here's the link for the templates and the names of those Federal Register notices. And I want to say miigwech, that's thank you in my native language, for being with us today, and I hope you found this training helpful.